All right, I'm going to do a really quick demo here that I think will solve two major issues that we have right now, maybe three major issues. Number one, when we see that left marker here, we want to turn immediately. And what I saw yesterday was us having to play around with that left marker, make it longer because it took a while for it to see it. I think that's partially caused by that 1200 millisecond wait. So I've got a solution with that using a timer instead of a wait function. I'll show you that in a minute. The other thing that I saw was we were getting false triggering when we were trying to count the marker count. So when this vehicle passes that left marker, we want to increment the marker count by only one. And I've got a solution for that as well. And then the last thing is when we're making this turn, sometimes we're coming in too steep, and that U-turn is really dependent on the radius or the diameter of this turn being precisely the distance between these two strips. I think there's another solution for that as well. So let me show you how this runs first. So digital input 5, I turn on to go into autonomous mode. I'm going to go ahead and hit play. And I'm going to pause it here for a second, right here before I hit that left marker. Now what you'll notice is my throttle's 200. I've got this timer 1 state. Timer 1 state 0 means start timing once we trigger it. The timer right now has a value of 0, so it's not timing anything. It's at 0. My throttle's at 200. My marker left's at false. My marker counts at 0, and my accumulated counts at 0. I'm going to go ahead and hit play, and I'm going to pause it when I get to this marker strip. Boom. As soon as I get to that marker strip, you'll see my marker count went to 1. I went ahead and slowed my throttle down, but you'll also see that I set the value of the timer to 4,000. As soon as I set the value of the timer to 4,000, that timer is going to start timing. So I've got a 4-second timer that I'm going to use to make this turn. I don't remember what my steering command is right now, but I got a pretty hard steering command in there to start making the U-turn with a throttle of 100. You'll notice I only got a count of 1 on the marker count, so let me keep going. The marker count stays at 1. That timer continues to time, and I'm making that sweeping U-turn. Now what you're going to notice here in a second is when this timer times out, when that timer gets to 0, I'm actually going to start to drive straight. So instead of turning the whole way through to that other strip, I'm going to get to a point where I'm at about a 15-degree angle, then I'm going to approach the strip straight. So you'll see that timer will time out. Now you see the vehicle is driving straight to that next strip, acquiring the strip, and I might even want to get a more narrow angle on that, but I'm not going to overshoot it anymore. I'm going to be able to correct for that and make changes on that. Let me go over how that works. So in the follow track sub, we've got the mode switch that determines if if the mode switch is false, then I'm in RC control. Well, that can stay in there. That's not going to affect what I'm going to talk about right now. But what I did was I've got on else if the marker left is true. Let me pull this aside a little bit here. I might be able to kind of show both of these at the same time. There we go. If the marker left is true and the timer is 0, that's initially where that timer starts because I haven't plugged a number into there, right? So the timer is going to be 0. Then I'm going to set the timer. What this does for me is that timer is going to continue to run in parallel to me looping through my code. So it's going to set itself to 4,000, and then I'm going to get the timer count. So all this set timer count means set timer 1 and set it to 4,000 milliseconds. And then get timer count is just going to return that and put it in a variable I called timer 1. And up top, I actually created some variables like timer 1 state and timer 1 and so on and so forth here. You don't need to have the timer 1 state necessarily. You could just have the timer 1 and get the timer value and put it into timer 1. Then I went ahead and set the throttle and the steering. That would represent the point at which I'm going to start that looping routine. But on the very next else if timer 1 is greater than 0, then I'm going to basically slow down and change my steering a little bit. What this does for me is you'll see this marker count ++ only occurs for that millisecond where timer 1 is 0 and the marker left is true. Marker left is true is going to be true for a while, right? However, timer 1's only going to be 0 when I jump into this else if statement. As soon as I get into here, timer 1's going to go to 4,000 and it's going to start counting down. At that point, I go into this other else if statement. where timer 1 is greater than 0, meaning I'm at 3,999, I'm at 3,998, I'm at 3,997, and it's going to go all the way down to 0. So this just started me steering off the strip, but only for 1 millisecond. This is what's going to steer me off the strip and do that big sweeping turn. You know, and you guys will play around with the throttle numbers and the steering numbers. And for whatever reason, the simulator, I have to use negative numbers. I know in the real world, you guys' numbers are going to be different. In the simulator, I had to use the opposite P gain as well. I'd use a P gain of negative instead of positive. Don't change what you're doing with your stuff because your numbers are correct. They may need to be tweaked a little bit is all. So I'm going to spend that 3,999 milliseconds in here making the turn. And then once that times out, what I did was I kept the throttle at 100, but I put the steering at 0. What that does for me is, let me close out of here real quick. What that does for me, I got to make sure I'm in autonomous mode. What that does for me is you'll see this hit the marker strip here, and I'll get that marker count will go up to 1, and it'll only go up to 1, and my timer will start timing. Well, I'm in that timer from 3,999 all the way down to 0. I'm making that big sweeping U-turn. But when I get to 0 on there, I go ahead and I set my steering back to 0 and my throttle to 100. And what that does is it drives straight towards that other strip. So and you guys could play with that and get it so that it's at a shallower line so we don't miss that. But if we come in too steep on that, we're going to overshoot like we have in the past. So the things that we struggled with is only getting a count 1, accumulation of 1 every time we hit that marker. Fix that. The other thing is we got rid of that 1,200 millisecond wait now, and we're doing all of that with just using this timer. So again, this triggers the turn to start and for me to set my timer. I'm going to accumulate the marker count, but I'm only going to accumulate it by 1, which is what I want. Then I'm not going to be accumulating the marker count anymore, even though the marker left is true. But because the timer is still greater than 0, I'm going to make that sweeping turn. Prior to getting to the other strip, I'm going to change my steering to 0 so I can drive in a straight line to try to acquire that other strip. And then anytime and that's when the tape detect is false. I'm still in between the strips, right? But I also am not timer 1 greater than 0, right? Timer 1 is at 0 now. So now I'm just no tape, drive straight. And then finally, if none of these are true, if I'm not using if I'm on the tape and I'm not using a timer and I don't have a marker left, then I'm just following the tape in a straight line like I normally would. So I hope that you guys can at least make sense of what I've got here. You will need to create a timer 1 variable as an integer, and then you just got to call these commands. Again, there's 4 timers available in the Robotech motor controller, and they're just called timer 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I set the timer count to 4,000. It's going to start timing. And then the timer 1, I get the get timer count, and that's going to get me out of this and then down to here. And it's going to guarantee that I'm not going to accumulate that other thing. And we could do something similar for the right marker or whatever else we might need to do. So I'm going to post this to YouTube and get it into the chat, and I hope somebody runs with this today, and we'll work on some of the yellow strips and other things as well. Thanks. Let me close out.